Here in Ottawa, the House of Commons is preparing for some very long late-night sittings next week. The opposition parties have put together more than 1,000 amendments to the government's omnibus budget implementation bill. This week, the Commons Finance Committee finished its study of the bill. I'm joined now by James Rajat. He's the Conservative Chair of the Finance Committee. John McCallum is the Liberals Treasury Board Critic. And joining us from Toronto is Peggy Nash, the NDP's Finance Critic and Vice Chair of the Finance Committee. Good to see you all. Thanks for joining me.
Good to be here.
Now,
Thanks, Martin.
I want to start with you, James Rajat. As Chair of the Committee, you have now delivered this omnibus bill to the full House of Commons. I want to get your reading. How do you think your committee hearings went? What do you think you achieved? How do you think it went?
Well, they were long, I will say that. Peggy and I spent a lot of hours in committee. I think we spent over 50 hours if you add up all the time with witnesses and discussion of clause by clause where we go through each specific area of the bill. I mean, obviously you have different perspectives on this bill. It's a very ambitious bill on the part of the government in terms of, jobs, growth, economic prosperity, responsible resource development. So there's a lot in this bill. It's a very ambitious program going forward, and clearly the opposition parties are opposed to that. So I thought there was a good debate, a good discussion on both sides, and Canadians will be the judge in terms of whether they feel they should support this bill or not, depending on the government's argument or the opposition argument. But we did table it on Thursday, so we're looking forward to report stage and all those votes, and then third reading hopefully coming up soon as well.
Just a quick question. You, the Conservative majority, voted down every single amendment, if I'm not mistaken, at committee stage. So you obviously you're obviously making the judgment on the part of the Conservative majority that this bill is lickety-split, hunky-dory. Nothing wrong with it. There's no room to entertain any amendments.
Well, there's a discussion on every amendment, but you're correct. I mean, on every amendment that was proposed by the opposition parties, the government had and they responded. There was obviously a rationale on part of the opposition party with their specific amendment, and then the government responded equally and said, this is why we oppose this specific amendment, and then there was a vote on the amendment. But that's all on the record, and Canadians can see what amendment was proposed and why the government opposed adding that amendment or changing the bill in that form.
Okay, Peggy Nash, you're reading as Vice Chair and sitting on that committee for all of those hours. Your reading of how the committee went, the study, how it went.
Well, I have to say it was kind of a ridiculous process. There's absolutely no reflection on James. He's an excellent chair. But it was ridiculous that we're dealing with this omnibus budget bill. Let me remind you, it's 753 clauses. Everything is diverse, from fishery allocation to the RCMP to employment insurance to environmental regulation to old age security, CSIS. This vast array of topics, most of which should not be in a budget bill and should have been deliberated by the relevant parliamentary committees where the critics could have cogently asked their questions and brought in their witnesses, and it would have been a much more open, logical, rational, democratic process. Instead, we ended up with these wide-ranging panels of witnesses, people who were national, sometimes international experts who would get 5 minutes to present their views, and it was just a kind of a crazy process. And all in all, just a couple of minutes to examine each of these massive number of clauses. And, some clauses are deceptive. There's one on environmental regulation where one clause went for over 67 pages. So you're talking about an enormous bill, and it for basic democratic process should have been broken up. And yes, we presented over 50 amendments to the committee. Each one was shot down. But I will say, some of the testimony was quite compelling. We had testimony on CSIS that warned the government not to make the change they want to make in terms of getting rid of the Inspector General, that could have very significant, far-reaching consequences. I know there was similar testimony heard around environmental issues. So I think the government has just decided to batten down the hatches and to heck with the consequences. I can't imagine why they would want to do that, but that seems to be their approach.
Okay, John McCallum, briefly, because I want to get to what's coming up next week, but your impressions now that the bill has been delivered to the House of Commons, to the General House.
Well, my main impression is that this government hasn't yet learned how to be an effective majority government, because an effective majority government will compromise on some things, allow some amendments, but Peter Van Lonen's government House Leader is intransigent on everything. And this is a totally ridiculous bill. As Peggy said, covering everything under the waterfront. A reasonable government would, for example, have produced an environmental bill separately. A majority government is a majority government. They can get what they want eventually, but I think they can do things better, more smoothly, without these hours of votes if they show a little bit more readiness to compromise with the opposition.
Okay, well, now speaking of hours of votes, let's get to next week. There are going to be, collectively, the opposition parties have tabled more than 1,000 amendments. Maybe 700 or 800 of them will be debated, and they may be grouped, but the voting will start next week. James Rajat, you know this bill. What do you make of the strategy that you're facing next week?
Well, one question would be, I mean, why not introduce those amendments at committee stage? We did have, as I mentioned, over 50 hours debate at our committee, and we also did the subcommittee, which was an attempt to address a lot of the concerns raised by people who are opposed to the bill, saying you should take that section, part 3, and study it separately. So that was what was done. So question one is, you know, why would they not introduce these at committee stage and have it debated there? To do it in the House, I mean, it seems designed to try to wear down the government and hopefully win a vote or two when not enough members are in the House. But I mean, we're prepared. We'll obviously show up for all of the votes, regardless of how many hours that will be. I think it shows, though, the government. I mean, the opposition is saying, well, if we worked with us, we'd get more things done. But in fact, I mean, we've had a tough time getting any bill through second reading in the House of Commons. And frankly, if you had this one budget bill into 20 different bills, the opposition would oppose all 20 bills and likely filibuster each one of those bills. So, the opposition has an important role in terms of opposing legislation that they want to oppose, but at some point the government has to be able to act on its agenda and act on the mandate given to it by the Canadian people.
Okay, Peggy Nash, let's look at these amendments. Next week, the amendments that you, the NDP, and the Liberals have been able to table are deleting amendments. They're basically amendments to strike down whole clauses and parts of the bill. And as I say, you submitted about 500, the Liberals about 500. They've been whittled down to a total of about 579. That's because you both sat at committee, the Liberals and NDP. Elizabeth May has another 200 at least substantive amendments which have been accepted and which will be debated. What do you hope to achieve by this whole process?
Well, first of all, let me say that part of this exercise is about trying to open up the process to Canadians. And I do think that if the Conservatives truly had confidence in the direction that of the changes they're making, they wouldn't be trying to bury things in this omnibus bill and ram it through at breakneck speed. Just this week in the House, we had, I think, the 24th time allocation motion where the Conservatives have cut off the time for debate. That, of course, happened with this bill as well, where we basically had a drop-dead time allocation on this bill, and anything we didn't agree with by the deadline was deemed to have been accepted. So, to be fair, we have not had a fair and thorough examination, and what we are trying to do is slow the process down a little bit so that in the meantime we can open it up to Canadians. As you know, we've held hearings across the country. We've been trying to let Canadians know what this is all about. I think it's starting to get out there a little more. And so what I think will happen, yes, because we and the Liberals are on the Finance Committee, but the independent MPs are not, only they can submit substantive amendments at the report stage. So our amendments can only be deletions. We also had some deletion motions at the committee stage. So what we're hoping to do is prolong the debate, try to open it up, and again signal to the government how very strongly we feel about A, the process that's taking place, and B, the direction of some of their changes, and that if they truly had confidence in these changes, they would separate this, not into 20 bills, but into a few more bills, and have a normal debate that allows Canadians to actually be part of this picture. I think this process is a bad one. I would hate for the government to think that somehow this becomes the normal way of proceeding in government, because I don't think it's right.
Okay, John McCallum, you, the Liberal Party, you decided very early in the game to put all of your eggs in the report stage basket. So in other words, what starts happening on Monday, the votes on all of these amendments, you were in there early with amendments. What are you hoping to achieve? I mean, a lot of people would say this is just really now a matter of, I don't know, taking time. Just basically, these are going to be voted and they're going to be voted down. Where do you go from here?
Well, I think it is an affront to democracy for the reasons that we've discussed, to have everything under the sun rammed through. As I said earlier, a majority government can ultimately get its way. But by the House Leader, Peter Van Loan, showing total intransigence, total unwillingness to compromise on anything, I think the opposition parties were drawn to this rather extreme outcome of votes going on for hours and hours and hours, because there was little alternative, because the government would not cooperate on anything. So I think what we want to do is send a very clear message to Canadians through this action that what the government is doing is undemocratic and inappropriate, and hopefully will never happen again.
Okay, last question to you, James Rajat, and this is just specifically to you, just briefly. One thing that did come up with your omnibus crime bill was that you got it through the House of Commons, and then you, as a government, realized that there's amendments that were needed, and you had to put, I think, 5 or 6 amendments to the Senate at the last minute, technical amendments, some of them fairly important amendments. Are you absolutely convinced that this bill is absolutely perfect, everything it should be, or are you maybe going so quickly that you may yourselves have to bring in amendments at the Senate or at a later point?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to presume what the Senate may or may not do. Obviously, being in the House of Commons, I can't tell the Senate what to do. I mean, that's why you have the 3 readings in the House of Commons, the 3 readings in the Senate, committee stage in both legislatures. And the Senate, in fact, has been doing pre-study on this bill, so I'm not aware of any amendments that the Senate's bringing forward, but they're certainly entitled to discuss it if they wish. In terms of the timeline, the process, I mean, we did the budget on March the 29th. We had hours of debate. In fact, we had one member of the opposition, member of the NDP, speak for 13 hours on the budget debate. Then we had second reading on this bill. Then we had over 50 hours at our committee, a subcommittee. Now we'll have report stage and third reading, and then on to the Senate. I think it's very hard for the opposition to convince Canadians that that length of a process is not enough when you're looking at a budget bill, despite the fact that it is 400 pages. I mean, you know, at a certain point, the government has to say we have to act on the mandate that we've been given. And the budget that was passed in Parliament, the March 29th budget, this bill is the first part in terms of fulfilling those measures. The second part will be in the fall. It will obviously come to the House of Commons. So.
Okay, James Rajat, Peggy Nash, and John McCallum, I want to wish you one thing, and that is a restful weekend, because we know next week you're going to be doing some very, very late nights, and we'll all be working along with you. So thanks very much for joining me now.
John,
thanks, Martin.
Thanks, Martin.